Hello, space friends. Captain Snuggles here, back in the public beta for X4 Foundations version 7.5. I'm continuing my quantitative evaluation of the update, this time moving on to what a lot of you have been asking for, the AI. Specifically, how the AI flies, with an emphasis on how it flies in high-attention combat. I'm focusing on the effects of the new flight model, but bear in mind that with AI behavior, it isn't possible to fully disentangle the effects of the new flight model itself from the effects of various secondary updates like the boost and the propulsion rebalance. I'll be comparing the AI's flight performance in Beta 7.5 with its performance in versions 7.0 and 7.1, using baseline data that I collected during those versions. This is not the best edited video I have ever made. Its focus is on providing information and feedback. There are supplemental videos linked in the description, which are just raw footage of some of the various tests I ran while conducting this evaluation. You may see footage from Beta 4. I redid all the tests for Beta 5, but if I found that behavior had not changed for a certain ship type, I retained the Beta 4 data and footage. Be warned, neither the footage nor the data paint a pretty picture. This is a work in progress. The AI updates are nowhere near complete, or at least I sure as hell hope they aren't. If you don't like what you see here, the best thing you can do is get involved in the public beta process and submit feedback. There's still time. Now, with that in mind, let's get started. Like last time, I'll give an overview of some general changes followed by the results of my quantitative testing. Like last time, I will provide some recommendations for Ecosoft. Unlike last time, Ecosoft hasn't shared any concrete goals with the community, so I just have to take my best guess at what their intended AI changes are and provide recommendations based on those guesses. We're going to start off with some general updates, which will include some background information as well as some changes in AI behavior that can be observed both in and out of combat. The first thing to be aware of is that the AI bends the rules of the flight model. It can teleport, it can phase through solid objects, it can boost backwards and sideways, it can decelerate any mass from any speed instantly, it can change the frame of reference for its velocity, and other wild and wacky maneuvers. None of these are actual active abilities. The AI isn't really activating a reverse booster or a short distance jump drive or anything like that. The game is just using the hand of God to move AI controlled ships where it wants them to go. Basically, they attempt to navigate using the actual flight model, but if they don't reach their destination quickly enough or accurately enough to satisfy the game, it just manually places them there instead. The Hand of God isn't new to version 7.5, it was in previous versions as well. So this is business as usual, but it's worth reiterating here because it means that the AI is not bound by the rules of the flight model to nearly the same extent as the player. A behavior that is new, or at least greatly expanded, is that the AI can fly in curved paths during travel mode. If ships are ordered to move to a new position while they are already in motion, they will attempt to plot a curved path to get there, as opposed to the old behavior of stopping, turning, and then starting again. This is most noticeable when they're moving fast, i.e. travel mode, although they'll do little mini curves if they have a lower starting velocity. It happens most often for ships in fleets, because fleet subordinates frequently get new orders from the commander while they're still in the middle of their previous orders. This is pretty nice for small and medium ships, which have the agility to make reasonably tight turns in travel mode. For capital ships, it's a mixed bag. They can't make tight turns in travel mode, so they have to start and stop their travel drives repeatedly, leading to slow, faltering maneuvers. In a test where I made ships turn 90 degrees and then fly 200 kilometers, I found that L-sized ships completed the maneuver 13% faster on average using the new curve method compared to the old stop and turn method. However, for XL ships, the new method was 34% slower than the old one. At the same time, all capital ships I tested had a turning radius of almost exactly 30 kilometers, meaning they deviated from the course I had plotted for them by 30 kilometers. That's a pretty long distance, and it can make the difference between a safe route and a deadly one. In my early test runs, I lost multiple destroyers because they went careening 30 kilometers off course and crashed into Xenon fleets and stations. So, maybe the 13% improvement to maneuvering speed is worth the risk for large ships, but for extra large ships, the 34% penalty to maneuvering speed combined with the increased risk makes this an objective downgrade in navigation behavior. And again, it is almost universally good for small and medium ships because they don't go nearly as far off course. I do have some very simple feedback for Ecosoft here, which is that this behavior should be removed for XL ships. People will not be happy about their Asgards and Raptors being both slower and more suicidal. Second suggestion, allow ships to turn while their travel drives are charging, maybe for the first half of the charge time. Currently, they don't start to turn until the travel drive activates, which means the charge time is just wasted, which means a lot of wasted time for ships that have to charge the travel drive repeatedly during this maneuver. Another general update is that collision behavior has changed. Even after relatively minor collisions, small ships go into very long spins. Between pitch, yaw, and roll, they always seem to correct their spin in 2 of the 3, but they'll stay rotating around that single third axis for a comically long period of time. It can be funny when they're not in combat, and deadly when they are in combat. The last general update I want to talk about is docking and undocking behavior. There have been a ton of issues with both docking and undocking during the beta, and Ecosoft has tried to implement an across-the-board fix in the form of partial collision deactivation. Ships that are docking or undocking can now no longer collide with each other, and they also can't collide with certain other things. I know that's vague, but I haven't been able to identify a consistent pattern in what they can and can't collide with. Overall, it is an improvement, but it does lead to some strange situations like this one, where these fighters can't collide with each other, and they can't collide with the stern of the Raptor, but they can collide with the medium hangar inside the Raptor, so they've all flown inside the Raptor's engine block and are all bunched up trying to fly through this wall. The physics engine is unable to identify them as being stuck, so they will stay in this state for as long as they are in high attention mode, whereas in the old model, they'd eventually have gotten booted out. My feedback for Ecosoft here is that if you're going to deactivate collision, then go all the way with it. I think the partial deactivation is weirder than full deactivation. That's it for the general updates. All the other changes are best described using the combat data. I had some great baseline data from earlier tests, specifically my 7.0 destroyer versus station testing and my 7.1 cost effectiveness testing. I repeated those tests pretty much exactly, along with a couple of supplemental tests, so we have some solid quantitative information on how the AI's performance has changed. The ship-to-ship combat data is a little hard to interpret because the enemy ships have also been affected by the new flight model. However, the main targets in the anti-ship tests were Xenon capital ships, which have always just been big, slow-moving turret platforms, meaning they don't rely on really precise maneuvers, meaning they're generally less affected by the flight model than other ships are. They have been affected somewhat, and Xenon escort ships have certainly been affected. We'll discuss those changes on a case-by-case basis to give a bit more context to the results we're seeing for player-owned AI-controlled ships. We're going to start out with ship-to-ship combat, which I tested by repeating my 7.1 cost-effectiveness trials. In case you haven't seen that video, the test was to fly one jump, destroy a Xenon fleet consisting of an I, 2 Ks, and about 30 escorts, then fly one more jump and destroy a second identical fleet, then destroy a Xenon defense station, then fly 2 more jumps to the finish line. We'll talk about station stuff later. Right now we're just focused on ship-to-ship combat, the engagements with the two Xenon fleets, as well as the travel time between them. I faithfully replicated the original fleet compositions, specifically the top performing composition for each class of ship. They all used a standard budget of about 150 million credits, with one exception. We'll talk about that exception first. That exception is standard fighters. In my original cost-effectiveness video, I only showcased fleet compositions that self-respecting humans might actually field, so although I did test this composition, I did not showcase it in the video. It is a swarm of flying garbage. 256 of the cheapest fighters available, with the cheapest loadouts available, assigned to position defense under the cheapest carrier available, all piloted by disposable one-star rookies. Specifically, we're talking Nodan Vanguards with Tau accelerators assigned to a Guppy. In 7.1, this was a phenomenal fleet composition. It only cost 50 million credits, but it matched or exceeded the anti-ship performance of all the other fleets that cost over 3 times as much. I was going to make a dedicated video for this, but I'm glad I didn't, because things have changed a little bit. Let's take a look. In blue, we have the 7.1 performance, and in yellow, we have the Beta 7.5 performance. You can see the 4 categories there. Broadly speaking, completion is analogous to overall combat effectiveness, survival is analogous to defensive power, combat time is analogous to offensive power, and travel time is analogous to mobility. To give a little bit more detail, completion represents the percentage of the target capital ships that were destroyed. Survival represents the percentage of ships that made it through the ship-to-ship combat portion. It just uses ship counts, not ship values, which is a little bit reductive, but we already have enough to talk about without bringing price tags into the mix. Combat time represents the average time it took to completely destroy one of the target fleets, which again was 1 I, 2 Ks, and roughly 30 escorts. And travel time represents the time between destruction of the first target fleet and engagement of the second target fleet. So it isn't just time spent in transit, it also includes the time required to recover and repair subordinates after combat. Although we're seeing the same perfect completion rate, the survival rate and travel time are both much worse. Survival has dropped from 81% to 60%, which means more than twice as many ships are being lost, while travel time has increased by over 50%. Those two things are linked. If more ships are getting destroyed, it stands to reason that more ships are being damaged, which means more time is needed for repairs in between battles. The bigger question is why this fleet is now losing more than twice as many ships, and the answer seems to lie in the combat time. Yes, the overall combat time is about the same, but the distribution of combat time has actually changed a lot. The fighters are spending less time dogfighting and more time engaging capital ships. There's a lot to unpack there, so let's dig into it. Combat between small and medium ships now plays less like dogfights and more like infantry battles. Fighters now like to fire from a mostly stationary position when possible, which makes them very easy targets themselves. If they get hit, they frequently reverse throttle, strafe down, and spin around as if they're trying to drop prone and find cover. Of course, there's no cover to find, so they continue to be easy targets, and they die much faster than they used to. Xenon fighters are terrible at everything except mobility, so now that they've given up their mobility, the fighter-on-fighter phase of combat gets resolved extremely quickly in the player's favor, whereas it used to involve long, drawn-out dogfights. On the other hand, here's what destroying a K used to look like. And here's what it looks like now. The average time it takes the Nodan swarm to kill a K has increased by about 30 seconds, or 85%. The average time it takes to kill an eye has increased by about 2 minutes, or 70%. Since they were attacking groups of 2 Ks and 1 eye, that means an additional 3 minutes per engagement, or 6 minutes per run, during which the Nodans were exposed to graviton fire. That accounts for the increased mortality. As for why the time to kill has changed so much, I don't have a quantitative pre-beta baseline, but it seems as though the interval between attack runs has increased and the duration of attack runs has decreased. So, fighters are spending less time firing their weapons than they used to, which means less applied DPS, leading to the compounding effects of the target's shields having more time to regenerate, and its turrets having more time to fire. All of that leads to a considerable decrease in the performance of this position defense fighter swarm, although it is still quite good. Meanwhile, the next composition is almost unchanged. This is what I call the naked heavy fighters. 168 heavy fighters, a mix of blast mortar Shis and pulse laser chimeras, with 3-star pilots and no carrier, hence naked. Any enemy anywhere near this fleet just evaporates. It was true before, and it's true now. There has been a slight increase in combat time, about 11%, which is because of the same thing we just discussed, the reduced engagement rate of fighters against capital ships. Due to the reduced engagement rate, the heavy fighter swarm's first blast mortar salvo is no longer strong enough to outright destroy the target. However, it still deals enough AoE damage to strip the turrets in one salvo, and any turrets that survive won't have the damage to one-shot a heavy fighter, so the additional engagement time doesn't translate into higher mortality. That is not the case for the carrier-based heavy fighters. I used the same heavy fighter loadouts, operating from a Shark, with Gorgon frigates to supplement the Chimeras on interception duty. Still, despite the power of the ships and the fast deployment rate of the Shark, this fleet can't achieve critical mass for single salvo turret stripping, so the reduced engagement rate of fighters against capitals leads to higher mortality, as well as greatly increased time to kill. Mortality is around 2.5 times greater, with survival rates of 74% now compared to 91% previously, and combat time has increased by a similar amount. Travel time has increased a bit as well, mainly because the Shark had some serious issues entering the superhighway during one run, and when ships encounter those issues in 7.5, they seem more debilitating than they were in 7.1. That wraps up the fighter compositions. Medium ships are notably missing from this dataset because I didn't have any dedicated baseline data on medium ships. I was not especially impressed by the performance of the Gorgons during the Shark runs, or the PEs I was fighting, but that's just anecdotal. Moving on, we've reached the dedicated capital fleets, starting with destroyers. Again, this was the top performing composition from the destroyer category in the previous test, which was 3 Rays, 3 Phoenix E's, and 4 Odysseus E's, all with standard turret loadouts, 3-star captains, and veteran crew. You can see clearly that performance has taken a nosedive here. Destroyers were already struggling to perform in 7.1, and now they simply don't perform. The 38% completion rate means they're only destroying 2 of the 6 Xenon capital ships, meaning they can't reliably clear a single Xenon fleet. In 7.1, they destroyed 4 targets on average, meaning they at least consistently defeated 1 full fleet. They even managed to take out both fleets one time, so some of them got to live to fight another day, which is not the case in 7.5, looking at that 0% survival rate. When they do manage to beat a fleet in 7.5, it takes over 20% longer. So, destroyers are fighting slower, killing much less, and dying much more. My observation is that they spend a lot of time strafing or sitting completely immobile at 0 meters per second, even if they're well within main battery range of their target. It seems like every time they reposition, they're scripted to spend a certain amount of time sitting completely still, followed by a certain amount of time strafing, which means there's a long delay before they rotate and engage with their main battery. By the time they're ready to aim and fire, the target has often moved either out of their range or into its range, both of which are bad news. Turrets already carried a lot of the weight in capital ship combat, and that's doubly true now, which gives turret-based ships an even bigger advantage than they had before. Case in point, the H can now solo up to 4 traditional destroyers, as shown in a couple of the videos in the description. And yes, it's just as slow and painful as it sounds. Speaking of slow and painful, we've reached the Asgard test. I really didn't want to do this one, because the Asgard has always performed incredibly poorly under AI control, and I didn't think my heart could take it. Still, I risked my heart for science, and it wasn't as bad as I expected. This composition was one Asgard with a standard fit of plasma, flak, and a few missiles, escorted by a defensive screen of 5 rays, all with 3-star captains and veteran crews. One thing to bear in mind is that I only did one run with this composition in 7.1. My rule back then was that if it didn't win its first run, it didn't get a second one. It didn't win, but it came the closest out of the 7.1 Asgard fleets, so it's the baseline. So we're working with a sample size of 1 for all 7.1 stats except travel time, for which I was able to pull some additional data. That travel time is much worse now, due to XL ships' struggles with the superhighway entrance. The completion rate is also slightly worse, but the survival is actually slightly better. There is a chance that this fleet can beat both the Xenon fleets. However, there's also a chance that it fails miserably and achieves nothing. Overall, I'd say performance is roughly equal on average. I don't think the Asgard has crossed any major threshold of viability with this patch. That's it for the ship-to-ship combat behavior analysis. The AI's performance hasn't improved in any meaningful way for any ship, and it's gotten meaningfully worse for most ships, with destroyers standing out as by far the biggest losers. Most of the changes come down to wasted time in combat, time during which the player's ships are being shot by the Xenon but are not shooting back. I do not know if those behaviors were intentionally scripted or if they're an accidental byproduct of the new flight model, but either way, they're having an undesirable effect. I really don't think Egosoft wanted to give a de facto buff to blast mortar heavy fighters while also nerfing destroyers into oblivion. My recommendation is that Egosoft reduce or remove all of the behaviors that force ships into inactivity in combat. I understand that they're meant to simulate actual fallible pilots and crews. I made a whole video about that. But this patch has taken it too far. Even from my perspective, as a vocal defender of X4's AI design philosophy, the AI has crossed the line from fallibility into ineptitude. To fix that, ships need to be allowed to fight, not forced to die. On that happy note, let's move on from the ship-to-ship combat to the station demolition tests. I attempted station demolition with the naked heavy fighters, the carrier heavy fighters, the Asgard, and the destroyers. The destroyers were the only ones for which I performed rigorous, repeated, dedicated tests. The others just attacked a station as part of the previous trial. I'll cover those briefly. Both of the heavy fighter compositions are very buggy when attacking stations. When I was able to avoid the bugs, the heavy fighters performed about the same as they did in 7.1. Throwing them at stations isn't smart, they take a lot of losses, but they can win. Meanwhile, the Asgard continued to not impress, just like in 7.0. It did not fly into the station's guns and die, so there's that. However, the Terran Intervention Corps showed up, and their entire fleet flew directly into the station and died, including their Asgard. Point being, I wouldn't put money on your Asgard not committing suicide against a station. Meanwhile, it did fire its main battery a few times, but it frequently missed, meaning its plasma turrets did most of the work, and they took so long that the nearby Xenon shipyard was able to build a brand new reaction force that came and killed the Asgard before it could take down the station. So I know that's pretty anecdotal, but that's what I have for the Asgard. What is distinctly not anecdotal is my destroyer dataset. I tested the hell out of these things, repeating my 7.0 tests using a fleet of 4 Phoenix E's, 2 Rays, and 2 Behemoth E's, with standard loadouts utilizing the best available Commonwealth gear. I also tried a fleet of 7 Terran-only Osakas, which I did test back in 7.0, although I never published the data. All the captains and crews had 2 stars, same as the original test. The target was a standard Xenon defense station. Here are the results. Completion is down from 100% to just 67%, and this time that stat was all or nothing. They won every single time in 7.1, but they lose 1 in 3 in 7.5. Survival is down dramatically. Mortality has quadrupled. And when they're even able to destroy the station, completion time has quintupled from 23 minutes to over 2 hours. In 7.1, out of the fleet compositions I worked with, destroyers were unequivocally the best ships for station demolition. In 7.5, they are unequivocally the worst. Despite all the trash I just talked about the Asgard, it was on track to destroy the station much faster than any of my destroyer runs. And despite the middling results for heavy fighters, they destroyed the station dramatically faster, more consistently, and with fewer losses than the destroyers. Let's look at what's happening. We already talked about how after destroyers move, they're essentially scripted to spend a certain amount of time idling, then a certain amount of time strafing, and only then are they allowed to aim and fire. In station assaults, destroyers are scripted to reposition way too often. There isn't any trigger for it. Ships will be sitting uncontested in a good firing position, firing their main batteries and hitting the station, when suddenly they'll just turn away and go somewhere else. In 7.0 and 7.1, that only happened when the station module they were targeting was destroyed, or when they took serious damage from something. Now it happens all the time, without a discernible trigger. As a result, destroyers are spending much more time repositioning, then idling, then strafing, which means they are spending much less time actually shooting the station, which leads to the dramatic increase in time to kill. It also leads to the increased mortality. Destroyers have a chance to reposition to any point around the station, including points directly across the station from them, which means their paths can lead them straight through the station's guns. The more often they reposition, the more likely they are to fly directly to their doom. In Beta 4, that led to an absurd mortality rate. In Beta 5, the devs have implemented a brute force solution by scripting destroyers to always reposition using a combination of boost and travel drive. They still fly straight through the station's field of fire, they just try to do it very quickly. For some combinations of ships and engines, that sort of works. For others, it very much doesn't. In a similar vein, in Beta 4, destroyers spent so much time strafing that they sometimes strafed multiple kilometers, taking them from a safe position right back into graviton range. In Beta 5, they still spend tons of time strafing and can still strafe multiple kilometers, but the devs have scripted them to choose firing locations farther from the station, in an attempt to keep their strafing from carrying them back into graviton range. For ships with 10-kilometer main battery range, that works. For others, not so much. So, all in all, some destroyers are performing better in Beta 5, but the solutions are not universal. The core issues are still there. We're still looking at quadruple mortality alongside quintuple the time requirement, and it all comes down to the constant repositioning, idling, and strafing. To actually solve those core issues, destroyers need to reposition less frequently, take safer routes when repositioning, and spend less time idling and strafing after repositioning. That's my minimum recommendation. I'd also recommend reversing both of the Beta 5 changes, at least temporarily. Neither the increased distance nor the mandatory boosting actually address the core issues, but they do conceal them, which will make it hard to determine whether future changes actually are addressing the core issues. And that's it for station demolition, which means we are finally wrapping up this video. In summary, 7.5 in its current state contains a lot of seemingly scripted inactivity by the AI, which has caused problems for all ships. The problems aren't distributed equally, though. Heavy fighters and battleships are only performing slightly worse, while other ship types are performing much worse, especially destroyers, which have plummeted to the absolute bottom of the tier list in all high-attention combat applications. Considering the focus on improving AI performance in 7.0 and 7.1, I do not think that this was Egosoft's intended design direction for 7.5. If that is the case, then alongside the case-by-case recommendations I made earlier, my primary recommendation is to remove or reduce every single behavior that forces ships into inactivity during combat, especially the cycle of relocation, idling, and strafing for destroyers. Meanwhile, I have another recommendation, not for Egosoft but for the veteran players, which is, if you're at all interested in playtesting, try the beta. Find bugs, test the new mechanics, and submit your bug reports and feedback. The more data they get, the more improvement we'll see. So, let's get them the data. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you'll tune in next time. And until then, this is Captain Snuggles, signing off.